Well, thank you, Mr. Duran. Chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, I thank the chairman, and again, I thank you all for being here. Ms. Conley, you mentioned, the structure, and that's very correct, and I think an important point to note. The United States needs to now go from, we remember in the Cold War, kind of a two-front war, to now basically two kinds of war, asymmetric and symmetric, and being able to prepare for the big fight, but also understanding we have to execute a fight against terrorism and also economically. So that's where I think some of that flexibility needs to come back. Just a small point of disagreement. You mentioned ultra-conservative groups, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think there's also groups on the left working on behalf of Vladimir Putin. You just look at Code Pink's occupation of the Venezuelan embassy to support a basically dictator that's a puppet of Vladimir Putin. So I think it's just important to point out that this is really all spectrums, and Russia uses all tools. Mr. Doran, I want to ask you how the Russian tactics are evolving. We've broadly grasped the existing hybrid warfare toolkit, but what do we expect in the next generation of tactics?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I would say this. When we look at the elements of Russian malign influence, I think you are absolutely correct to ask the evolution question. Oftentimes at CIPA, we think about these techniques as a virus. In order to understand a virus, you have to first understand how it evolves and mutates, what you're dealing with. Where I would stress for this committee to pay most attention to is the way in which Russia can compete against us for pennies on the dollar. Every single effort we put to counter them costs us more money than they require to attack us. So on steps of evolving, Russia is limited only by the creativity of the GRU and some of their malign actors in Europe. I wouldn't begin to speculate as to how a virus would evolve as much as I would about how Russia can evolve. What I can say is that we need to stop playing whack-a-mole with the Kremlin, and we need to raise the costs on Vladimir Putin so he does not deploy these techniques against us in the first place.
Thank you. I think that builds into the idea of, look back, we hate this term, mutual assured destruction, and the nuclear side was not a good thing. But I think we need to make it clear to the Russians that we can do to you what you can do to us. That raises the cost on them. Vladimir Putin fears nothing more than losing his grip on power, and I think we ought to threaten that way. So I also want to ask the whole panel, Russia's use of armed mercenary groups like the Wagner Group to secure their interests and support brutal dictators like Assad and Maduro is another example of their low-cost, high-reward strategy to hinder our interests. Our military has shown that we will respond to Russian aggressions from these groups when provoked, as we did when we quickly obliterated a regiment of the Wagner Group in Syria. However, the sanctions we have on officials connected with the group have not stopped their recent deployment to Venezuela and several sub-Saharan African countries. I'll start with you, Mr. Doran. We can ask the whole panel. What would you suggest in terms of a more effective response against Russia's use of paramilitary groups like Wagner?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I would underscore my first position that we need to dramatically raise the financial costs on the Kremlin should we decide that they have escalated. If we determine as a country that Russia is using its paramilitary forces against us, I think the ending of the buying and selling of Russian sovereign debt in our markets is a good first step, and I know that is a question before this Congress.
Anybody else?
Congressman, I would argue we must make a declarative policy that the Wagner Group we recognize as a branch of the Russian military and treat it as a hostile action. What's making Wagner so effective is that Vladimir Putin can immediately send those forces. He can achieve his political objective with military means. He's not threatening it. He's doing it and stopping the U.S. He's stopping any advancement of the U.S. and its objectives. And then we have to confront whether it's worth lives to fight that. And that's what he's banking on. We have to make the costs greater. We have to, Russia right now is so extended in Syria and Central African Republic, within Venezuela. We have to make that, squeeze those costs and make them greater. They're going to expend themselves, then we have to make that as painful as possible. But we also have to get our policy house in order and have clear policies with allies that can be more anticipatory rather than simply responding to Russia's quicker action.
And I noticed he got pretty quiet after the Syria incident. Ms. Rosenberg?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I agree with Heather that we need to recognize the role that Wagner is playing vis-a-vis the Russian government. I'd also note, though, that the key suspected financier and one of the key founders of the Wagner Group are actually both under U.S. sanctions already. But what I think we need to do is look at how Wagner operates. It actually seems to operate based on resource contracts. So if we look in Syria, reports have indicated that Prigozhin and the Syrian government maintain a contract to grant Prigozhin a cut of profits from oil fields retaken by Wagner. In Sudan, the group is reportedly providing security for gold mines. The group is also reportedly acting as personal security and as military trainers in Africa. So it speaks to the systemic nature, again, of the entire financial ecosystem and the corrupt nature that groups like Wagner are able to exploit in order to get these kickbacks.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. No offense, but I'm out of time, so I'll skip you if you don't mind. Thank you.